Welcome to another edition of Ask the Beer Guy. This is your host, John Griffin, the beer drinking professor. Welcome to episode 3 of Ask the Beer Guy's podcast. And I want to welcome you this week. We're going to talk about hops for our Beer Geek session. We're going to talk a little NFL football and some beer news related to that. Some questions we have answered, one on hops and also on the distribution of beer. We're going to talk about New York and talk about what the governor's doing to help the beer industry in New York and also help the tax base, I'm assuming. Got some interesting news from the Freakin Frog, some unbelievable beer that's going to be on tap for Halloween night only. I've got a news article on the strongest beer in the world and why it really isn't. Remember, marketers lie, and I'll tell you why. And did Jesus drink beer, especially? Or was he just a wine guy? So all that and maybe a little more is coming up on this episode, number 3. And I'm going to talk about my usual, what I'm drinking, and it happens to be my number 3 desert island beer, which is Sierra Nevada Pale Ale. People think, man, why did you pick that beer? And if you knew my number 1 and 2, which I'll reveal in the next couple weeks, it's really going to seem a little out of place. But Sierra Nevada Pale Ale to me is just a classic of a great drinking American-style pale ale that's just hoppy and bitter enough to, keep my interest, but not so bitter that it just wipes my palate out, and not malty enough that it's not a great beer for the summertime. Remember, I'm living in Las Vegas, so I love the balance of it, even though it's balanced to the hoppy side. American Pale Ale, if you've never had them, say you're not in America, are basically Americanized versions of the British style, using American ingredients usually, a little bit hoppier, a little less malt body, but there's definitely malt there. It shouldn't just be a bunch of hop water. But that's the reason I love Sierra Nevada Pale Ale. I'm sure many people love it too. It's one of the top microbreweries in the country, and you can buy it almost everywhere now. When I first started drinking it, it was really only available in California, along with a lot of their beers, and they slowly spread out. Remember, I was in Boston, and it was the first time I actually saw Sierra Nevada east of the Colorado River, and I had to get my Swedish friend who was living there at the time to try it, and he actually loved it, even though it was a lot different than the typical lager most people were drinking back in the early 90s. So that's what I'm drinking. I love it. The quality's great, and if you like a great, refreshing all-around beer, especially in the summertime, try Sierra Nevada Pale Ale.
There's nothing like a cold beer.
I like to have funny beer news, and there's always something every week that's kind of hilarious. And this one is talking about Chris Cooley, who's just got re-signed with the Washington Redskins NFL football team. And for those of you outside the States, I'm sure you can imagine, but these guys are not on the unemployment rolls making no money. These guys have tons of money, and one of the funny things is that he actually wanted a case of beer negotiated in his contract. Not per week, that would be kind of funny, but he just, I guess to kind of be, to prove that he wasn't a fat slob and out of shape, he basically said, I want to have a 30-pack of Coors Heavy into the contract that he had. So the Redskins basically said, nope, not going to do it, because they're worried about the salary cap, and that 30-pack of beer might have put him over the salary cap. They also mentioned that the guy negotiating, it's the first time he's ever said no to a player in a negotiation, but I thought it was kind of funny. It's a short little thing, but if NFL football players want Coors, then I guess it's okay.
There's nothing like a cold beer.
If you happen to be in Las Vegas, and I know a few of my readers are, or if you're coming in the next week or so, I want to let you know about the Freakin Frog. Most of you know about it if you're a beer geek, but it's a beer bar in Las Vegas owned by my friend Adam Carmer, who also teaches at UNLV. And he's probably got the largest beer selection, certainly in Nevada, if not on the West Coast. Last count was over 900 beers, I believe. He's got the whiskey attic upstairs, which is the largest whiskey collection you're going to find anywhere. And what I want to mention is he's got some interesting beers coming up, and one of them is Gonzo. On Halloween night, they're going to get rid of Flying Dog's, the Colorado Brewery Flying Dog's Gonzo Imperial Porter. That's the last keg anybody knows about, and it's a 9.2% porter that scored a 99 on ratebeer.com, and that was a long time ago. So this is a classic, and it was brewed in honor of Hunter Thompson. This has been aged since its release in 2005, so that makes it a whopping 7-year-old beer. But don't worry, don't let the beer commercials fool you. Fresh beer isn't always good beer. Sometimes these big old imperial porters, imperial stouts are 100 times better 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 years from now. So if you happen to be in Las Vegas on Halloween, stop by the Freakin Frog, which is across from UNLV, on Wednesday, and they're going to have that poured until it's run out. I don't know the cost. They didn't tell me. One other thing that the Freakin Frog does is they have cask beer tastings, and the next one's going to be on October 30th, so the day before, and it's going to be cask number 6, Old Engine Oil Reserve, which, if anybody knows, is a brewery from England, and it's actually from Clackmannshire in the UK. And this isn't just the regular stout. This is a reserve version of it. It's jet black. It's a bucket list brew for any beer lover. And this is the only cask there is of this in the world, because none of it was put in a cask except for this one for the Freakin Frog. So there's very limited seating. Go to freakinfrog.com. That's FREAKIN frog, FROG.com, and you can get the information there, or you can call 702-217-6794. And first come, and they pour till the cask is done. It is $45 a person, but they usually have food. I will be there, so you can meet me if you want. And they also have a new fresh menu that you can check out as well.
There's nothing like a cold beer.
We have another company from Scotland making some crazy beers. And it's probably time to talk about fermenting versus distilling, because this brewery, which is the Brewmeister Brewery based in Kincardine O'Neill, is claiming they have a beer with 65% alcohol by volume. So as you know, that would be impossible to ferment a beer that high of alcohol. As far as I'm concerned, Sam Adams still has the real highest volume of beer, because that's truly fermented. What these guys do is they actually cold distill. They're calling it cold fermenting or freeze fermenting, but in reality what they're doing is distilling, because distilling can either be hot or cold, and you're either boiling the water off to produce alcohol, or you're freezing the water to produce alcohol, because if water freezes before alcohol does, they bring the beer down to freezing, take all the water ice off, and then it leaves a concentrated beer. So in my mind, that's not a true beer. It's really a liquor because it's distilled. In fact, you can't even legally sell that if you make it in the United States, because the U.S. considers freezing a form of distillation. Whenever you concentrate alcohol, that's what it is. So it's probably a great beer. I wouldn't mind trying it, and 330 milliliter bottles is what they sell it at, and they're basically saying it's a hoppy but slightly sweet, which I could imagine because of all the malt that comes out, and they're saying to serve it in brandy size measures. If you want to check it out, they have a Facebook page, and they're called the Brewmeister Brewery, BREWMEISTER Brewery, and they also create some traditional pale ales and darks and other things like that. But if you happen to be in a place where you can buy that and try it out, and please let me know. Just remember, it's really a distilled drink. It's not a fermented beer.
There's nothing like a cold beer.
Ran across an interesting article in Bloomberg Business Week about New York, and they're trying to boost their beer, wine, and liquor sales. And Governor Andrew Cuomo said that the state government will put beer, wine, and liquor promotions on steroids to boost jobs and help the small yet growing industries. It's kind of interesting because, to me, if you don't know me, I'm a big history buff for beer. I especially like U.S. beer history. Anybody that studies Prohibition will know that one of the reasons that we ended Prohibition was because of the economic situation, and the taxes from alcohol were the cause for ending Prohibition. So now that the state of New York's in a big deficit, they don't say that in the article, of course, but I believe that they understand that taxing alcohol is an easy way to get more revenue for the state, just like they did back in Prohibition. That's how we got our three-tier system in the United States, where distribution, manufacturing, and retail are three different tiers in the system, which for you, those of you outside the United States, may seem like a strange deal. In fact, I had some guys from Australia wanted my help in distributing some Australian beers. I said, look, it's not like we can just bring the beer into the U.S. We've got every state has different laws as well as the federal government, and a distributor can't be an importer in most states, and they certainly can't own bars and everything else. So this is all really kind of funny to me that Governor Cuomo all of a sudden decided that beer, wine, and alcohol are going to be the big things. So what they decided to do, they're going to put $1 million tourism ads promoting New York wine. They're going to use PR firms to target New York City restaurants to sell and promote New York products. They're going to work with top chefs in the Food Network, who happens to be based in New York, to promote products. It's funny also that his girlfriend is Sandra Lee, is not part of the plans, Governor Cuomo's girlfriend, but they're going to promote everything. There's 75 wineries and breweries opposed to the proposed drilling. Cuomo also did a similar summit on Greek yogurt this summer, and that resulted in easing some of the environmental protection restrictions on dairy farms that the wineries and breweries are talking about because of fracking and some other things. Many of the breweries and wineries are against the proposed drilling, and I guess Cuomo's trying to appease them by saying, look, we're going to help promote your businesses, but you got to help us out here.
There's nothing like a cold beer.
Was beer in the Bible? Dr. James Browley, a professor of Department of Religious Studies at the Millsaps College, recently said that it almost certainly was, and part of the question was, did Jesus drink beer or was he strictly a wine man? It was all kind of serious, but at the same time in fun because of the Greek week that happens with sororities and fraternities on the campus. And they talk about what it was really like there and how beer was basically started in the Fertile Crescent, which, as somebody who loves the history of beer, I've studied a lot about, and they're actually saying that beer probably changed the way the world was, not just was part of it. And there's a lot of new theories about, and there's a lot of evidence showing the beer drinking and beer making practices of the time, especially when Jesus was around, was very popular. Mesopotamia, Egypt, the entire Fertile Crescent, including ancient Israel, which is kind of funny because beer is almost impossible to find in most of those areas due to religious purposes. And Mississippi, where the college is located, just passed some new laws allowing more high-quality beers in, so they were trying to link that as well, comparing modern Mississippi with what the Israelites and the biblical era had. One of the questions asked is, would some religious people's views about alcohol change in any way if they understood ancient beer culture? And it's rather interesting that, you know, many of the, especially Southern Christian religions and certainly Islam, they shun almost all alcohol, if not all alcohol. But biblically, at least for the Christians, there's an argument to be made that many of the people of that era drank, including Jesus. So Browley says, our culture clearly has difficulties handling alcohol, as one can see from our drunk driving accident rates, but it's not because our laws are not strict enough, since in cultures where drinking laws are much more lenient and wine and beer are part of daily life from a young age, there are often fewer difficulties. So he makes the same argument that I make. In Europe, at least there historically used to be a lot less hang-up about how old you were when you drank, and it was not a big deal to go get beer or wine or any other alcohol, so people tend not to abuse it. Not that there aren't people abusing it, but the incidence is a lot less, especially in the westernized parts of Europe. Certainly in the communist part, there's a lot of alcoholism in Russia and Poland and those places, the former Eastern Bloc, but that's for other reasons. Bally also goes on and says, furthermore, the idea that religious people should abstain from all alcoholic beverages is a fairly modern one in history and peculiarly Christian, and it's certainly not the case in the ancient world of Israel or other Mediterranean cultures or among most early Christians. The wise use of these beverages and the wise use of all creation in the ancient world and today is the lesson that sages both ancient and modern teach. So he's basically saying beer is a biblical drink, so keep drinking. And I'm going to talk about beer history in a couple weeks here, and I'll get into the ancient beer culture and how there's a lot of new archaeological evidence that beer actually did save the world in many ways. And if it wasn't for beer, we probably wouldn't be living in our agrarian society. We'd still be nomads. So drink up.
There's nothing like a cold beer.
For our Beer Geek lesson this week, we're going to talk about hops. And they're also known by the Latin name Humulus lupus. And they were named by the Romans lupus due to the growing among the reeds like a wolf among sheep. So you'll hear a lot of people talk about being hop heads, and they love hops, and most of them kind of know what the main reason for hops are. They're mainly for bittering, those people that like extremely bitter beer. There's also some aroma components, and there's of course flavor. But when people talk about being a hoppy beer, generally they're talking about the bittering, because you can have a beer that's not very bitter, that's got a lot of hop aroma, and most people would just call that, you know, a hop, a great hop aroma, but they wouldn't necessarily call it a beer for hop heads. Most people know hops for the bittering component, although aroma is certainly a big part of it, especially in American beers, which use what's called dry hopping. And dry hopping is basically when the beer is already fermented, they transfer it to another tank and they throw in some hops to give it some aroma, a lot more aroma. And they found now, and I've talked about it before, but they found that there's a little bit of flavor and a little bit of bittering also given off because there's alcohol-soluble components. Before, they used to think it only was good for aroma, which it still is mainly. So if you see dry hop beer, you're going to not necessarily have a bitter beer, but you're certainly going to have a beer with a lot of hop aroma. One of the traditional reasons to use hops was to take a very sweet beer and counteract that. And if you think about cereal like grape nuts or some kind of barley cereal, without any hops, it's sweet. That's why people like it as a cereal to eat in the morning or hot or whatever. And wort, which is what's unfermented beer, without hops or some other way to counteract the sweetness, the beer would be almost undrinkable. It would taste kind of like Malta, which is a non-alcoholic beer that's sold for kids all around Latin America. So hops are the bitter component, and they can add many specific characters to a beer. And before hops were used, many brewers used whatever bitter herbs or flowers were around, and traditionally that was called gruit. Dandelion, burdock root, marigold, and heather were often used. Heather, of course, in Scotland. Hops also add a preservative aspect to the beer, which is one of the reasons hops were first used in beer, because it was found to have antibacterial function. Of course, they didn't know it was antibacterial at the time, but they knew that the beer lasted longer with hops, and the bitterness was a great byproduct of that. They've been in and out of favor, but the Germans were the ones who really brought hops to the mainstream. And the one thing to know about if you're a brewer or a beer lover or even a home brewer is that there's many different varieties of hops, but there's three main types of hops that we can break up. The first ones we're going to call the noble hops, and those are generally used for aroma, and they're valued for their aromatic properties. They generally have floral or spicy components to them, and you'll hear names like Saaz, Hallertauer, Tettnang, or Spalt. Notice they're all German except for the Saaz, which is a Czechoslovakian hop. There's other hops that are really prized for bittering, and those would be like Brewer's Gold, Nugget, Galena, and others are sort of in between, and you'll see Pearl, a German hop, Centennial, which is kind of an American hop, and Northern Brewer. These are kind of used in both bittering and aroma and flavor. And another thing to know is that British hops, if you're trying to make an authentic British beer, you want to use British hops because they have a certain earthy, mushroomy, dirt type of flavor and aroma. And we talked about the noble hops. They're going to be floral. That's mainly German style beers. And if you're doing a Saaz hop, that'll be a little spicier. And if you're doing American style ales, of course you can use any hop in American beer. That's part of the characteristic. But if you want that real Northwest flavor and aroma and bittering, you want to use a Northwest hop, which are going to have more citrusy, pine, maybe some forest, depending on the property. So it is kind of important what hops you pick. Is it the most important thing in a beer? For some styles it may be, but generally yeast is probably your most important thing in your fermentation temperature. But if you put the wrong hop in a beer and it's only used for bittering, it's probably not going to be noticed. If it's a big American IPA and you don't put in any bittering or aroma hops, at least American ones that have that citrusy character, people are going to think it's more like a British style of an American IPA. So that's the main thing you need to know about hops.
There's nothing like a cold beer.
Now we're at the question section, and I actually got a couple of questions from Brian, so I'll answer both his today. One's about hops and the other one's about the actual brewing process. So his first question is, are there different hops, different types of hops, or if you grow them differently, will they have a better taste? So Brian, I hate to say this, but the answer is yes, and it depends. There's obviously a lot of different hops, and depending where you grow them, you could have the same exact hop and it would not only taste different, if you want to use the flavor portion, they'd have a different aroma possibly, and they certainly could have some different bittering components. And remember that we talked earlier about the three different regions, you know, the noble hops, the British style hops, and the American hops. And of course now there's Australian and New Zealand's becoming big producers. But I haven't had much experience with those, so I can't tell you the exact profiles of those. But if you take a German hop and you grow it there, it's going to have more of a German character, the noble hop character, floral, bright, maybe spicy, depending on what the type is. Then you brought that hop rhizome over to England and you grew it there, it would get more of the earthy, mushroomy English character that people would expect. Then say you brought it over to the Northwest and grew it up in Oregon or Washington, you're going to get much more of that Pacific Northwest, citrusy, possibly some piney, pine forest type of notes to it. So just the earth and the water that it grows in, the temperature and all that's going to make a difference. In the wine world, that's called terroir. So you can use the same thing regarding hops and even barley. Anything organic, and I don't mean organic in the sense of no pesticides, but a living product like a plant is going to be different every batch and every crop, I should say, and every season and every different location. So most of the time when you see hops, they take a whole bunch from the farm and they average it out. So remember that, you know, if something says 10 alpha acids, that doesn't mean every single piece is 10. That's the average of that bunch. And in case I didn't mention it, which I think I forgot, alpha acids are how you measure the bitterness in hops. So hope that answered your hop question, and now I'll go on to your next one, which is how long does it take to make a beer from the moment production starts until it's shipped to a store? Well, again, Brian, I'm going to say it depends. If you're a brew pub, certainly it can be anywhere from 2 to 3 weeks, which would be probably a little fast, but there are certainly, you know, Hefeweizen and some fast fermenting British ales that you could do that quick. If you're on average, probably 4 to 6 weeks, I would say, for a brew pub. If you're doing lagers, it's going to be 6 weeks to 2 months, maybe, depending how long you actually lager. If you're talking about actually to a store or a bar, then you're talking about the 3-tier system again, at least in the States. So you've got to make it, then you've got to send it to a distributor, then the distributor's got to actually ship it to the end user location, the retail spot. I'd say on average, in a fast time, it would be about 2 months for an ale and 3 to 4 months minimum for a lager. If they're coming from Europe, it's going to take a lot longer, obviously, depending on if you're in New York or California. You know, they mostly go by boat, and that takes time. I know my friend who imports German beer into California. It takes him about month and a half to 2 months from the time it leaves the dock at the brewery until it hits his warehouse through customs and all that, on top of the 2 to 3 months of lagering that goes on in the German brewery. So we're already at 5 months. Then it goes to the distributor, which is probably another week or two, maybe even longer if he's going cross country with it. Then from the distributor, it's got to go to the retail location. So now we're talking an imported German lager, probably anywhere from 4 to 6 months minimum before it sees the shelf. So British beer would be a little less long because they're ales, but it seems to me that a lot of the English beers don't survive the journey on a ship as well. I find them to be a little bit lifeless. Even ones that are in brown bottles cans tend to hold up better, which is a reason why if I'm buying English beers, I tend to want to get it in a can if I can't get it on tap somewhere. Because remember, a can is nothing but a small keg. There's very little air, no light can get in it. It's a great way to do beer. Unfortunately, I don't see any time in the near future that home brewers are going to be able to do that. So that's about that answer. There are beers that are actually longer, though. I mean, there's certain barley wines that age a year before they're bottled. Certainly some Belgian beers are 1 to 3 years before they're bottled or shipped or anything else. So, in general, take, 1 month or so for a beer pub ale, couple months for a normal ale to a store, and it can be anywhere from 2 to 6 months for lagers, depending where they're from. So I hope that helps answer your questions. Thank you for listening to the Ask the Beer Guy podcast. If you have any questions or want to sign up for notifications about beer news, please make sure you visit askthebeerguy.com. There's a form there. Don't worry, we don't spam. So enjoy the podcast, and I hope to see you next week.
There's nothing like a cold beer.